Kia ora folks, hey, look, we will get underway. We are recording, just so legally you have to know that we're recording. So Sarah's happy with that. It's nice to see you here this morning. I'm going to do a bit of an introduction for Mr. Glen Sowry, who's come along. And I'm going to go back to when he was younger, not that he's old, but he had a very illustrious early part of his life, and hopefully he'll tell us about that as a sailor. So Glen was selected to sail, so Glen sailed a lot, and in fact he went to the Olympics and sailed in the Tornado event at the 2000 Olympics, yeah. And then was involved in the 2004 Olympics as a selector, is that right? Yeah, but Glen also sailed on Sir Peter Blake's boat in the Whitbread Round the World race, and I was thinking as young people you might not know that much about the Whitbread Round the World. When I was your age, that race that happened every 4 years was absolutely huge, and the whole country would follow it, and it was a really big deal because Kiwis pretty much always competed in it and generally did pretty well. Not always, but generally, and the country used to really watch that race, so it was a really big deal, kind of like the Rugby World Cup or something, is probably how I remember it. So Glen first sailed in the 85-86 race on Lion, New Zealand, Sir Peter Blake's boat, and then he sailed on a boat called Steinlager 2, which was a really interesting boat, and Steinlager 2 kind of did something that had never been done before, and it won all 6 legs of the race. So there was kind of the round the world was broken into 6 bits, and Steinlager 2 won every single bit. And that was a really big deal at the time, wasn't it? Like, it was an amazing thing, and it was a really amazing boat. And so Glen was on that, and then he was part of the America's Cup in 91-92, and then was the watch captain on the boat New Zealand Endeavour for the 93-94 Whitbread. So it's had a lot to do with sailing, but then kind of Glen moved from being a professional sailor to a whole lot of leadership roles, and that included a big role at Air New Zealand. He was there for roughly a decade, and that included 3 years as General Manager of Operations and led a big team across New Zealand, Australia and the Pacific Islands. He was CEO of Housing New Zealand, so that is a big job in New Zealand, claiming for order now. And then he was CEO of a NZX-listed retirement village operator called MetLife Care. And now he is the CEO of Queenstown Airport. So he is very close to us. Glen was one of the inaugural winners of a Blake Award in 2005. So he has got lots of leadership experience, and hopefully we'll hear about that today. And Glen and I were just, and Mrs. Tapp were just talking because Glen has a connection to Wakatipu High School because his niece is an alumni, Merida Sowry, who probably you folks are too young to remember, but we think she was probably class of 2017 or something like that. That is Glen's niece. So it is a real pleasure to have Glen here, and we'll put our hands together and welcome Glen.
Morena, guys, and thank you for the invitation to come along and have a chat. I was realising these are all really smart young people, and when you're telling them the years that I was doing this stuff, they'll be working out, man, he's really old. But I love coming to speak to young people who are really invested in and focus on leadership, because you guys are the future of our country. And the role of leadership, I think, is a bit underestimated. And so firstly, congratulations and well done to all of you for stepping up and taking on leadership roles here at the high school. And I hope that you learn a lot from that experience and that you take it through into the years ahead in your career and what you choose to do. What I thought I'd do this morning, I've got no slides, no props, no kind of multimedia stuff. I'll leave you guys to work out how to run all of that. But I thought what I'd like to do is just share with you a little bit about my story and what I've learned along the way about leadership. And the great thing that I look back on that's been an unbelievable privilege is I've had the opportunity to work alongside some extraordinary leaders. And when you do that, if you're curious, you know, the opportunity to learn just by watching and observing great leaders in action is incredible. And often you don't even know or realize what you're learning because it's just happening around you and you're just experiencing excellence. And often it's not till a little bit later when you get into your own, you know, bigger leadership role yourself, you look back and you think, man, that was really smart what that person did. And so I'd like to share just, a few little stories of what I've learned from exceptional leaders along the way. And, maybe some of it might resonate with you and it's something you can carry forward. As Steve said, please don't call me Mr. Sowry, otherwise I'll think I'm in trouble with the principal. But as Steve said, Sir Peter Blake, he died before any of you were born. Have you all heard of Sir Peter Blake? Yeah. So when I was a kid, I grew up in Wellington, and sorry, what's your name again? The goalie in the soccer team.
Sorry?
What was your name again?
Rohil.
So Rohil's in the first 11, good soccer player. I was really crap at soccer. And so I was, anything with a ball, I had the hand-eye coordination of a snail. So I was really useless at ball sports, and was growing up in my era, pretty much all sports was soccer or rugby or cricket or something like that. And I wasn't very good at it because I just didn't, for whatever reason, God hadn't gifted me with a lot of natural talent in that space. And so I discovered sailing, and no one in our family sailed, but I just got introduced to it one day, and I got taken out for a ride on a little boat called a P-class, what we used to race in those days, a little 7-foot boat. And it absolutely lit a fire inside me. I can't explain why, but just the idea of being out on the water and it's almost like a 3D chess game of what's going on with the wind and the water and the competition and the tactics and all the rest of it. I really got fired up by it. And so my parents, to their great credit, they knew nothing about sailing, but they bought me my first P-class, cost a couple of $100. And we moved to a place called Parramatta, which is just north of Wellington City on the coast. And we had a boat shed at the bottom of our property. And it's a bit like you guys having a ski mountain right next door. So for me, I could go and do it all the time. And so I spent a huge amount of time out on the water and got very, very passionate about it. And one of the things I learned very quickly is that you're never going to master anything if you don't invest a lot of time doing it. And I think it doesn't matter what you're going to do, whether it's academic, whether it's business, whether it's sport, the idea that you're going to achieve mastery in whatever you're passionate about and choosing to do without putting in the hard yards, unless you're some sort of genius, it's just not going to happen. So hard work will always precede success. And so I learned an awful lot about that at a young age. And when I was growing up, the whitbread, as Steve said, was a really big deal. Everyone used to follow it very closely, and so I was super passionate about the idea of doing the whitbread. And so bear in mind for a minute, I was your age or a little bit older. I was in my late teens. I left high school. I went to a school called Mana College in Porirua. Got UE, all that stuff. But interestingly, no one in my family had ever been to university. We're a family of tradies. And so unlike you guys, many if not most of you will likely go to university. When I grew up, it was actually not all that common around where I lived. And so a lot of people went to work and did different stuff, and they weren't dumb. It was just what you did. And so we had a family history of being electricians, and so I went and became a sparky. And one of the first lessons in life I learned was my dad, who was actually a surveyor, land surveyor by profession. He said to me, Glenn, the first thing you really need to learn is how to work. And so he made sure that I went and worked for a small electrical firm, family business, where there was only 3 or 4 of us in it. There was nowhere to hide, and you had to work hard. And so I certainly learned a lot through that period. But I also quite quickly learned that I didn't want to be an electrician in my life. So I didn't want to crawl under houses and through roofs for the rest of my life. And I kind of felt like I had a wee bit more in the tank than that. And so all through that period, I was getting more and more competitive in sailing. And another thing that I learned over that era was when I was racing P class, would have been about 15, and I was racing one day against a guy called Russell Coots. Now Russell Coots got a property here, and for those of you that have heard of him, he's the most sort of successful America's Cup skipper in history. He won an Olympic gold medal for New Zealand back in the day, so super talented sailor. But he and I were peers and used to race against each other as kids. And I came in one day from a race, and I'd been leading it, and Russell just put me at the finish line, and I came in with all of the emotional regulation of a 15-year-old guy, like roughly none. And I was all grumpy and upset, and I said to Dad, geez, that Coots is lucky. And my dad looked at me and he said, Glenn, you're going to learn one thing in life. Luck has a habit of following those who work hardest for it. And he turned around and walked off. So I was standing there going, But it's interesting, I could walk you back to the exact beach and the exact spot on the edge of Wellington Harbour where my father said that to me. It was that impactful in my life because it really stopped me in my tracks and thought, okay, I'm going to need to own this. And if I want to be successful, I'm really going to have to work hard at this. So when I look back now, I don't feel so bad about the fact that Coots beat me because he's done pretty well since. Over that period, as I said, I was really passionate and followed the Whitbread Round the World race, and I started writing letters. So can you imagine, you guys, with your phones and sort of instant everything, digital, we used to write letters to each other. And so I used to write letters to Peter Blake, who had just skipped a boat in the Whitbread called Ceramco, New Zealand. It was his first time as skipper. And I was writing to him to say, I'd love to crew on your boat next time, which would be a bit like you writing to Jacinda Clark and saying, I'd like to be your next Minister of Finance in the next government. And there was that bold. It was ridiculous when I look back. But I used to write these letters to him and never got any reply. And about 3 years later, I moved to Auckland at age 21, and the World Championship in the Olympic class boat I was sailing in at the time was being held in Auckland. Long story short, we did pretty well. We won a couple of races in the World Champs, and I was a nobody from Wellington. And we ended up coming 10th out of 80 boats from all around the world with all the top Olympic sailors in the world. And so suddenly I went from this nobody to actually having a bit of a profile. And I was about a month after that, I was doing a big match racing regatta crewing for one of the famous American guys. And I was at the yacht squadron after that. And someone came up to me, a guy called Peter Montgomery, who was a media guy, and he said, Glenn, there's someone I'd like you to meet. And he walked me across this crowded room, and I came face to face with God, otherwise known as Peter Blake. And Blakey was a big dude. He was 6'4", sort of big, and he had long blonde hair because he had wingnut ears, so he liked to hide them under his hair. But he was a really imposing sort of a character, quite big, tall, and he'd sort of look down at you like this. And he said, oh, nice to meet you, Glenn. And he said, thanks for all of your letters. And would you like to come to lunch next Saturday with Pippa and I at our place? So I was standing there doing my best goldfish impression. And so I said, I'd love to. And what was amazing, when I had lunch with Peter that next week, we barely talked about yachting. What he was really interested in was who I was as a person, what my values were, the way I thought about things. And it was a very casual conversation. And I look back now and it was absolutely masterful, because what he was seeking to do was to understand what made me tick. And was I going to be a team player on his boat? Because on a boat, like on a Whitbread boat, there are roughly 15 of you. and you live in a tiny little space, you share bunks, you hop out of the bunk, someone hops back in, you never sleep for more than 4 hours at a time for a month. There's no heating, there's no washing. It's pretty full on. And so in that environment, if you've got a boat full of rock stars that don't work as a team, it's just not going to work. So above all else, you need people that are going to be able to, operate as an effective team. And to use that great, sorry Steve, politically correct expression, no dickheads. Just people that are good, low ego people, but are really good at what they do and are going to pull together as a really effective team. Because when times get tough, and they do, you've really got to have each other's backs. And so looking back at that, it was an extraordinary experience. And so I got picked by Peter to sail online. At the time, so I was 21, so I was green as grass. And in that race that year online New Zealand, it takes about 9 months to sail around the world, all the stops and the legs that Steve talked about. I don't mind admitting, that was my growing into being a man part of my life, because I was a kid going into that, but being surrounded by these people and living this extraordinary experience, I got the opportunity to really grow up, and it had a huge effect on my life. I was very fortunate, Blakey asked me back to sail on Starlight too. Steve mentioned that was an incredible campaign. And interestingly, we remain the only team still to this day to have won all 6 legs. No one's ever been able to repeat it. It's that tough to do. So that's something I look back on with a great deal of pride. But when I look back, there was so much about the way Peter led that was just genius. And it wasn't anything, like you read online about all the tech entrepreneurs or anything like that. It was just building a really great team environment, about giving people the opportunity to lead their parts of it, creating really clear goals and frameworks about what performance looks like. And the other thing Peter did that I observed for the first time was he used this mantra, and I learned it again many, many times after. It was always praise in public. So if someone's done something well, make sure you celebrate and you recognise someone doing something well in front of everyone, because it's great to celebrate and use that to role model what good performance looks like. But if someone's having a bad day or it's not going so well, always have that conversation in private, never in front of others. And you stop and think about it and you sort of go, yeah, well, that makes sense. Because none of us like to be called out in front of our friends or our peers. You don't mind, I'm sure most of us don't, or none of us really enjoy getting a conversation about you need to lift your game. But if you're going to have it, you'd much rather have that in private with your coach or your boss or whomever than in front of all of your mates or your colleagues. But equally, if you've done something well, you like everyone to know about it. So those are very simple principles, but I'm amazed at how many people don't get it right. Much later in life, Steve mentioned I had a decade working on the executive team at Air New Zealand. Now, when I was headhunted or shoulder tapped, call it what you will, to come and join Air New Zealand, it was at a time when the airline wasn't in great shape. So back before you guys were born, and around 2001, you've all heard of 9/11 and all that sort of stuff. At about exactly the same time, Air New Zealand owned an airline in Australia called Ansett, which was competition to Qantas. And so Air New Zealand made this big bold play to buy this Aussie airline to take on Qantas. And it turned out, to be frank, to be a bit of a dog. And it went broke. And then you had 9/11 on top of it. And right at that time, Air New Zealand collapsed financially. It's hard to imagine, but they went broke. And so the government had to step in and recapitalise or financially bail out Air New Zealand. So not the proudest day in the airline's history or period of time. But at around that time, you know, the airline it wasn't famous for its customer service or a lot of the stuff that it does pretty well these days. The brand wasn't in very good shape. Most people thought it was a pretty arrogant organisation. And they brought in a guy called Ralph Norris. Has anyone ever heard of him? So Ralph, he's now Sir Ralph Norris, he became CEO of Air New Zealand. He had been CEO of ASB Bank immediately prior to that. And when he left Air New Zealand, he went to be CEO of a company called Commonwealth Bank of Australia, which is the biggest bank in Australasia, massive. And he did that for a few years, and that year was when he left there, he was recognised as the best CEO in Australia and New Zealand. So he's a very, very capable dude. So Ralph hired me to join the exec team at Air New Zealand, and Ralph had a great reputation as a corporate leader. And when I met Ralph to get this job, it was like being interviewed by Sir Peter Blake again. If I close my eyes and change the voice, it was an identical conversation. It wasn't about, so tell me about a time you've done this, or, you know, how much money have you made, or any of that stuff. That did not come into the conversation. Again, it was all about values, team fit, culture, and work ethic. Those are the things he's really interested in. And it was quite incredible. For me, it was a real sense of deja vu. But Ralph had this wonderful turn of phrase, and he used to talk to me a lot about leadership. And he had this great expression that I love. And it's, as leaders, I really encourage you to think about this in the future. The leader doesn't have to be the biggest person or the biggest voice. And in fact, most effective leaders are the exact opposite. They quietly push from behind and nurture and grow people and set standards. And Ralph had this expression that grass doesn't grow under big trees. You just stop and think about that for a minute. A big tree, the metaphor is a leader with a big presence. And if you're so big and such a big personality that the people around and under you can't grow and develop. The other thing he was really big on was customer first. So if you're running any sort of business with customers, and pretty every business does have customers, otherwise they don't exist, really putting it in the front of everything you do. And I got a real lesson in that one day. One of the perks of being on the exec team at Air New Zealand is you often get to fly up the front, which is pretty cool. But one day I was doing a work trip sitting beside Ralph, flying from Auckland across to Sydney for a work meeting, and we're sitting in business class. And in business class, it's pretty cool. They come round and they ask you, give you a choice of breakfast and stuff like that. And we were sitting at the front of the plane, the very front row. And so when the crew started doing it, they came to us, said, what would you like, Mr. Norris, with Sowry, for breakfast? And it's something I've never forgotten. And Ralph said, it's all right, just make sure all of the customers have their first pick of what they'd like for their breakfast, and I'll have whatever's left over. Because I only have a finite number of each selection. And I just thought, wow, how impressive is that? And it might seem trivial and a bit silly to you, but I can guarantee that crew member, because Ralph just made that crew member's life a whole lot easier. They weren't going to have to say, I'm sorry, that's not available, if someone further back in business class had chosen a meal that Ralph had already taken. So it's a real sense of selflessness. But the other thing was, it was just common sense. Everyone around us has paid good money to be on that plane, and we want them to have the best experience they can. And as it turned out, we both got our first choice anyway. But the symbolism of that, I thought, was incredibly powerful. And I've always carried that with me ever since that day. And the other thing that Ralph taught me, and I think as leaders, particularly as young leaders, it doesn't necessarily come that naturally. And that is that when you're leading a team and in your careers in the future, hopefully all of you will get to, to lead people in organisations. His thing was, and again, I think it was one of the best bits of advice I ever got, always try and hire people smarter than yourself. Just stop and think about that. Always try and hire people smarter than you. Now, when you're younger, early in your career, you're trying to prove yourself, yeah? And you say, look at me, I'm pretty good, I'm smart, and look what I can do. And that's okay, I think, early in your career when you're establishing your own reputations and you're demonstrating your capability. But as you get a bit on in your career and you're not having to try and prove yourself all the time, success is hiring people who are really, really good at what they do and hopefully better in all of the positions they have than you ever are. And a lot of people, it's amazing the number of people that don't do that because they feel this sense of, well, I've got to prove I'm the best or the smartest and the biggest tree. But when you hire people that have incredible talent, best thing about it is they make you look good. Because when they're great at their role, it's just like Steve, I'm sure, you just try and hire the best teaching staff you can because it makes Steve as the principal look pretty good. Because the school performs well, you guys do well academically, you grow into great young people. Steve looks famous. He is. But it's really smart leadership. And so I think, particularly, as a younger person, that might not seem very natural to do. But if you can have the self-awareness to do that and to really grow and develop talent underneath you, it makes life a hell of a lot easier. And your success will be created from the capability of the people that you have working with you. So I think those are the things, in my business career, there's lots of kind of boring business stuff. But if I think about leadership, those are the real gems, or some of them, that I carry with me and think about regularly. And often, faced with a tricky situation at work, I'll ask myself inside my head, what would Blakey do here? And if it was a really crunchy business problem, what would Ralph do? And I think always learning and observing off people who do things really well. And if you keep, building that memory bank or that kind of library of great experiences and things that you've seen that people do really smartly, I think is the best way to learn, in my view. So when I look back, if I kind of think about the key things that I've learned through all of that, and in my business career, when I think about it, as I said, I started as a Sparky, and I finished up being CEO of 3 pretty big companies. And I've got lots of my yachting friends, yachting mates that I sailed back in the day. My nickname when I sailed was Foxy. Don't ask me why, we're not going there today. But my nickname was Foxy, and they would, these yachting friends of mine who have been pretty successful in their own right, but they often look at me and scratch their head and say, how the hell did you do that, Foxy? You're just a kind of yachting bum like us, how have you ended up doing that? And I've often sort of stopped to reflect and think about it. And I think probably the one thing that I've done is taken risk. And risk isn't a comfortable thing. And the risk that I've been prepared to take is that when an opportunity presents itself career-wise to do a job or to go and do something different, I've been prepared to say, you know what, I've got no idea if I can do this. I've got no idea how I'm going to do this. but I'm going to back myself to work hard, and I know I've got, you know, some capability, but I'm going to work my butt off and I'm going to make a success of this. And I think if you have that attitude and you're prepared to take and I'm not talking about reckless risk, but a calculated risk, you know, I reckon you'll really fail. As an R-A-R-E-L-Y, not really fail, but it's very unlikely you'll fail. And the number of times as a leader, I've given opportunities to people that I've seen with talent and ambition and capability and said, I'd back you to do this. I've never, ever been disappointed with that person. And I think if you mentor them, if you give them some support and framework of how to get the job done, people almost will always succeed. And so my encouragement, if there's one thing I would like you to go away from today thinking about, is to have the confidence to take a risk. And I think it's a tricky thing. But I think, you know, if someone's got the faith in you to give you an opportunity and a chance, they've seen something in you that you probably haven't seen in yourself. So grab it with both hands and run at it. And I think you'll be incredibly successful and almost certainly surprise yourself with what you're capable of achieving. The other thing that I look back and I've learned is that in life, and I know here at school that you take your values very seriously. You've created your own school values, but each and every one of you will have a set of values that are intrinsic to you. They're absolutely unique to you as a person. You might not be able to articulate them particularly clearly and label them or whatever, but you'll know if you're in a situation that aligns with your values, the world is a happy place and things tend to go pretty well. Similarly, when you're in a situation and you might not be able to put your finger on it, but it doesn't feel right, you don't feel like you fit, you know, it's just not gelling, often that will be a misalignment of values of yours and the organisations or the people you're working with. And so the importance of, as you mature and our values evolve as we get older and, you know, our lives, you know, change as we go, your values will steadily evolve. But we didn't, I was very fortunate 5 years ago to attend an executive management program. It was a residential program for a month in France at Europe's top business school called ENSEAD, a place called Fontainebleau. And it was an extraordinary experience with 60 CEOs from all around the world. But we spent a half-day session on defining your individual values. And I won't try and explain it all to you here, but at the end of the exercise, because it took a long time to get there, but at the end of the exercise, you had 9 post-it notes sitting on the table in front of you, and those are your values. And it took a bit to work them out, but when I looked at it, the fog cleared, and I just thought, man, those are them. And I have those in my phone, just in my photo album, and I will occasionally refer back to them if things aren't feeling like they're working quite right at work or in my life, and I think, yeah, that one's not quite in alignment. So I think understanding, you know, what makes you tick, what you're comfortable with and what you're not, and a lot of this will be the way you've been brought up, your experience here at Wakatipu High School. All of these things will be incredibly formative in what shapes each and every one of your individual value sets. And I think if you can think carefully about that as you go through your career, it'll make a big difference. The other bit, I think, is follow your passion. You know, look, people, as I said, I didn't go to university. I was well capable. I could have gone and become a lawyer or done something. Had the intellect to do it, but just didn't. But I look back and I think in some respects, I'm kind of glad I didn't, because I had the opportunity to find my way later in life into a career that really worked for me. And I was able to follow my passion. And for all of my 20s and very early 30s, my passion was professional yachting. And so I got to get paid to do what I love to do. How cool is that? But I got to the end of it and I thought, this isn't what I want to spend my whole career doing. And I want to go and stretch myself intellectually quite a bit more. And that's why I got into business. But I think whatever your passion is, make sure that there's some connection with that in what you do in your careers. If your parents are really pushing you to become a lawyer or a doctor or whatever, and it's just not kind of lighting your fire, probably a good idea not to do it. Equally, if it is, if that's what you're really interested in, and you think that that's something you could be highly motivated by, grab it with both hands and run with it. And as I mentioned, looking back, my dad was, my first big role model in my life. He was someone who, very low-key sort of a fellow, but he had those little pearls of wisdom I shared with you. Luck has a habit of following those who work hardest for it. Learn to work hard. And very rarely will success come easily for something that's worth doing. So he was a huge impact in my younger adult life. So Peter Blake was an enormous impact, positive impact in my life, and learned a huge amount off him and got an extraordinary opportunity. And later in life, in my business career, Sir Ralph Norris, with some of those stories I was sharing with you about the way he led, and kind of it looked at the way he led the organisations and thought about customers and all those sort of things were incredibly, incredibly powerful. But the other things, I think, I'd just like to leave you with 2 or 3 little things that I think I've learned, and they may be of value to you. Above all else, be authentic. Don't try and be something you're not, because it's pretty hard to carry that act off all the time, and people can smell the difference between authenticity and fakeness. And as long as you're authentic about your values and who you are and the way you operate, and the great thing is each of you are individuals in your own right. You do things differently, and you're your own authentic self. Always have that out front. Always. Believe in yourself. Back yourself. That's different from arrogance and cockiness, because that's awful. But having the quiet confidence and self-assuredness that you've got more ability inside you than even you, any of you sitting here today have got so much more talent and ability than you've got any idea about today. And it will emerge over time. So believe in yourself. Take pride in growing and seeing others grow. I'm kind of old and grey now, but the thing I get most enjoyment about or from in my career now and in my life is seeing people that I work with growing and developing and becoming bigger and more successful people. I get more of a kick out of that than anything else these days. And then the final thing sounds very trite, but have fun. It's a really important thing. And if that's one thing I learned off Blakey, with the team environment, he always made sure that we had fun, made it a fun environment, because we spend, doesn't matter whether it's in your sport, in your career or whatever, if you're not having fun doing it, you're probably not going to succeed. And it doesn't mean it's all got to be party all the time, because it won't be. But you've got to enjoy the endeavour and what it is that you're doing and the people that you're with. So those are kind of my reflections. hopefully some of that might have gelled or connected with you. But that certainly really worked for me. And when I look back, I've been very blessed. I've had a great career. I've had a lot of fun doing sport at an elite level. But there are some real common themes that have run right through that whole journey. And with a bit of luck, some of those will resonate with you and you'll be able to carry them with you in your careers. And Steve, thank you for the opportunity to come along and speak to the team today. And